Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Think 20 panel discussion on empowering citizens globally, building accessible, inclusive, and affordable digital public infrastructure. Thank you so much for joining us today. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements before we begin. First, as the event is being recorded, request everyone to please keep their mobile phones either on silent mode or switched off throughout the duration of the discussion. Second, after we conclude, please join us for tea, coffee, and refreshments in the lobby area outside. I would now request Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, Director, T20 Secretariat, Center for New Economic Diplomacy and ORF Kolkata, to give the welcome address.
Nelly Liosk, Ambassador at Large, Digital Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Estonia. Dr. Devanjan Chakraborty, who is about to come, he's on his way, the Director, British Council, East and Northeast India. Dr. Tirumala Santra Mandal, Associate Vice President, Research and Communications, ICO TechSoft. Mr. Varun Kaul, Program Officer, Digital Health, South Asia Hub Path. Anisha Singh Motwani, Founder and CEO, Hawas QED, and National Council Member, Wiki Arts Leadership Council. Mr. Vivek Abraham, Volunteer iSpirit, and my colleague at ORF, Anirban Sharma. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all at the first T20 side event, Empowering Citizens Digitally, Building Affordable, Accessible, and Inclusive Digital Public Infrastructure, organized at Observer Research Foundation, Kolkata. T20 or Think 20 is an official engagement group of the G20. It serves as an idea bank or emerges as a melting pot of ideas and thoughts for the G20 by bringing together think tanks and high-level experts to discuss policy issues relevant to the G20. Now, all these T20 recommendations are synthesized into policy briefs and presented to the G20 working groups, ministerial meetings, and leaders' summit to help the G20 deliver concrete policy measures. And I'm indeed elated today that the first T20 side event is taking place at ORF Kolkata, and that too on a theme that is an extremely vital component of human existence and development in the modern world. It is hypothesized that economies with robust digital public infrastructures, or DPIs as the acronym goes, are in better positions in building back better, rather building forward better, even after withstanding exogenous and endogenous shocks that might be geopolitical in nature, socio-political, economic in nature, or emerging from endogenous systems, endogenous variables. In the process, better opportunities for business and livelihoods can also be created. In other words, better DPIs are necessary conditions for creating more resilient social, economic, and political systems. As president of the G20 in 2023, India is uniquely positioned to mainstream the DPIs into the broader global digital agenda, as also, in fact, in the broader global developmental agenda. India is a leader in this domain, having successfully implemented and scaled digital identity like the Aadhaar and payment or the UPI systems, for instance. In fact, a very recent paper has been published by ORF scholars which analyzes the impact of technology through the Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana and the Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana on women's financial inclusion in India, and thereby the pursuit of the SDGs. Now, the paper also offers recommendations for the G20's priorities for improving women's financial inclusion and promoting female entrepreneurship under the presidency of India. I'm pretty sure that with the varied expertise in the panel today, we will come up with some exciting ideas to ponder for the G20 in the context of the social impact in the digital domain. And many thanks to all the speakers for making their time out for today, and thanks to the lovely gathering for making this event a worthwhile effort on our side. And with that, I would like to hand over to Mr. Anirban Sharma, Senior Fellow, Observer Research Foundation, and Chair of the Task Force on the Digital Domain, to chair this particular session. Anirban, over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh. Is this mic working? I hope it is. Yes. All right. So a very good afternoon to your colleagues and friends once again, and a very warm welcome to RF's first official T20 event. The theme of today's panel, as you know, is Empowering Citizens Digitally, Building Affordable, Accessible, and Inclusive DPI. Now, just by way of introduction, before we actually get into the substantive discussions, DPIs are foundational population scale technology systems, such as identity systems, social registries, and payment systems, upon which the digital economy is built. DPIs allow, and this is an important feature, they allow multiple actors to build applications and solutions on top of them. And this enables a wide spectrum of essential public and private services to be delivered to citizens at a greatly improved speed and scale. A metaphor commonly used is that of a digital railroad that is used to connect with citizens more efficiently. Now, the COVID pandemic and more recently the Ukraine war have in many ways driven home the importance of DPIs. Several countries used their existing platforms during these crises to provide targeted social protection assistance to their citizens. Others rapidly undertook to build their own newer platforms during this period. More broadly, globally in the last few years, there has been a marked increase and rise in the demand for DPIs, and their development has now emerged as a key focus area for international collaboration and support. And we will actually be touching upon that a little during our discussions. Earlier last year, the Indian government listed DPIs as a priority area for India's G20 presidency. And indeed, given the success of some of the DPIs that we have here, Aadhaar and UPI were just mentioned by Dr. Ghosh, India really is uniquely positioned to mainstream some of the discourse around DPIs into the global digital agenda around digital issues. That is the broad context for our discussions today, and we have an excellent panel here to help us understand some of the key issues around DPIs and the use of digital infrastructures in sector-specific areas, health, education, entrepreneurship, and women's empowerment. So just to introduce the panel that we have, to my right is Ambassador Nelly Leos, who is the Ambassador at Large for Digital Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Estonia. She is responsible for the development and coordination of Estonia's digital diplomacy, and over the past 20 years, she has advised political and public sector leaders in digital governance and the digital economy in more than 40 countries in Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. So a warm welcome to you once again. Also because this happens to be your first trip to Calcutta, so an especially warm welcome, really. Dr. Devanjan Chakraborty will arrive in a moment, and he is the director of the British Council for East and Northeast India. He has over 20 years of experience in leading education, development, the arts and cultural collaboration programs in India and internationally for the British Council. Importantly for our purpose today, he is also presently the lead for all 4 UK government agencies in India for the cultural track of the G20. My left is Dr. Tirumala Santhramandal, who is the Assistant Vice President of Research and Communications at iCure TechSoft. She holds a PhD from IIT Kharagpur, and Dr. Mandal has been actively working in research interventions in the areas of maternal health, diabetic retinopathy, and the empowerment of frontline health workers using technology. Mr. Vivek Abraham, to my left here, is a volunteer at ISPERT, which stands for Indian Software Product Industry Roundtable. He is currently a core member of the ISPERT team working on multiple tracks of engagement with the government, focusing on G20 specifically, and is responsible for representing ISPERT's views on DPIs in all major discussions during the G20. Your views are going to be very important for it. Ms. Anisha Singh Motwani, also to my left, is the founder and CEO of Havas QVD, one of Kolkata's leading integrated and digital marketing agencies. With over 15 years of experience in marketing, she has led the company past several milestones, the most recent being the strategic partnership with global media conglomerate, the Havas Group, after which your company is now known as Havas QVD. She was recognized as one of the most influential businesswomen of the year 2022 by Innovative Zone, was awarded the Woman Entrepreneur Award in 2022 by Great Companies, and also presented with East India's Woman Leaders Award by CMOE. Clearly last year was a very big year for you, right? And finally, Mr. Varun Kaul, to my right, is a program officer for digital health at the South Asia Hub of PATH. He specializes in public health, innovation management, impact funding, and implementation, and has supported the rollout of the India's National Digital Health Mission, led by the National Health Authority. His other work has included working directly with digital public goods, conducting multi-country digital health landscaping exercises, and supporting the development of global health data governance frameworks. So, a very warm welcome to all of you once again. Before we begin the actual interventions, just a sort of note to the panelists. There is somebody hidden in this room with a bell and a clock, all right? And once you touch 5 minutes, you will hear a faint ringing of a bell. That's a sign. Once you touch 7 minutes, that ringing is going to become rather more insistent, all right? And once you cross 7 minutes, well, we don't even want to go there. So, all right, so 5 to 7 minutes is the time each of you have. And we have quite a lot of ground to cover, so let's just dive into the discussion straight away and begin with Ambassador Lyask. All right. So, ma'am, what we'd like to ask you is, within the EU, Estonia is one of the countries that has been at the forefront of developing digital public infrastructure. And why has this been so important, and what is the impact DPIs are having on governance? Could you tell us about some of the major initiatives undertaken and the lessons learned from them?
Thank you. I don't know, do I have to speak loud? I will speak loud. So it's really a great pleasure to be here today, but also yesterday at the G20 symposium on digital public infrastructure. And as it was kindly referred to, the reason why I am here is that digital public infrastructure has been put very high in Estonia's national digitalization agenda, and now increasingly also in our foreign digital policy agenda, because, as it was said, I am not working in institutions responsible for digitalization, but I am in a foreign office, so I'm a diplomat. But just perhaps to bring a distinction between digital public infrastructure and digital public goods, that we will probably also hear more, and digitalization. So we do make a difference between public sector digitalization and, in a way, digital public infrastructure, digital public goods. And digital public goods for us really mean open source, shareable, reusable, commonly done goods that we can all share, whereas public sector digitalization at large does not have to entirely follow it. So there is a small distinction that we do make between Estonia and India, even though I would otherwise say that despite seeming differences, I do not know whether you have visited Estonia, but it's a very small nation of 1.3 million in the north of Europe, and India that has a much bigger population. Despite these differences, we have some similarities, and actually we have become, I would say, two reference models in the world for digital public infrastructure, and I am very grateful for the collaboration that we have had over the past 10 to 15 years in digital sphere, and I hope it's increasing also during the G20 presidency, where digital public infrastructure has been very rightfully put high in the priority. But why digital public infrastructure? And I think there are some things I also emphasized yesterday that I would like to bring out. We have to a little bit go back in time and understand where Estonia comes from. So we regained our independence in 1991. And this more or less coincided with the invention of the browser that made internet available to the masses. So Estonian government then realized that this is actually an opportunity for Estonia to actually become bigger than our size is, because technology allows you to do things differently and actually cut workforce. So this was an important aspect for us. But when we now come to digital public infrastructure, and when we look at some core components of our digital public infrastructure, such as digital identity that allows to authenticate and also give a signature, when we look at data exchange layer X-Road, or let's say data governance and data exchange and interoperability which is another, let's say, a big aspect of digitalization. Why this happened in Estonia was actually because of lack of resources. And this, as I said, may not be a burning issue for India, that is a big country. But for us, it was the matter of really pooling resources across government, but across private and public sector. Because this was a time when we realized that actually the needs of our organizations in public sector, but in private sector, banks, for example, are actually quite similar in digitalization. They all needed to exchange data to either provide better services to people, but they all needed to, let's say, allow for the access of data also for transparency purposes, because there is always this big brother affair. So Estonian government really opened up, giving everybody an opportunity to see the data that the government holds about the person, and also how it uses that data. So this was, in a way, an important aspect. So what we did, instead of developing different solutions for different organizations, we started to reuse it. So we have one digital identity across all governments, similar to India, but also it's used by private sector. So it allowed us to guarantee that we pull resources from government, but also private sector. So, for example, the same identity is also used for banking services. Of course, this is very, I would say, peculiar to Estonia, also because of the right timing. Probably at this moment, when banks have already introduced their own authentication systems, where people are very used to using it won't be possible to do. And now we are pooling these resources also across borders. So we are collaborating actually with our closest partners, Finland, Iceland, where we have created a foundation to develop and maintain certain digital public goods. And we also make these available to other countries. And I think this is also an opportunity for G20, because other countries have also similar. But I know that the bell already rang. My 5 minutes is soon over. But two other aspects, apart, of course, from providing better services to people, providing back what the government is doing, there is actually a big aspect of openness and transparency, and I would say the democratic development of digital society. And this has been really important in building trust, as we really wanted to break through whatever we had before. It has been actually vital, and it was actually how it started. It started more from these sort of inspirations to become an open, inclusive, democratic state that took us actually to the digital development we have seen, and Estonia is one of the more advanced digital nations. But apart from this, I will make my last 2 points why digitalization and digital public infrastructure has, let's say, transferred or transcended from our national development to international, is that it is more and more related to digital autonomy or sovereignty. Of course, there are certain dependencies between states in technology that will always remain there. But now when we look at the application layer, then it gives everybody a chance to know what is happening. So all public sector digital developments in Estonia have to be on open code. This does not mean that they are all made open to others, but for the government, it is open. And we have also, of course, our public sector repository of open solutions that everybody can reuse. And the last moment, as also the war was brought out here, what we have seen is that increasingly cyber attacks are not targeted only at critical infrastructure or government databases that we have been mainly seeing, let's say, over the past 10, 20 years, but they are increasingly being used at public services, but also private services that people use. So it is really important to build a digitally strong state to protect the citizens of your country. It may concern education, healthcare, kindergartens, and so forth. So I would end from my side not to have more bells, but I am glad to stay here longer and also.
Opening intervention, Ambassador, and we will come back for a quick second round towards the end about key lessons. Certain approaches could be institutionalized. Second, I would like to move on to Vivek Abraham. Drawing on some of India's leading DPI success stories, what qualities do you think make for good, robust, and secure DPIs? And also, given the opportunities that public infrastructure open up for private innovation and applications, who do you think should actually fund the creation of DPIs? Glad to hear your thoughts about that.
No, thank you, Anirban. And first of all, I must compliment you on putting together this discussion. It's vital and important. And also, thank you for your question. Although I feel you can have an entire symposium on all those questions that you just raised. But I'll try and touch on some points before I hear the bell. I think one of the first things that becomes important in building a DPI is to understand the context and what you're solving for. And that's the beauty of having the solution based in DPIs, is that you're able to very easily customize and build for the context that you're solving. And I think I'll just touch upon one particular use case that's been going on in the country, which is the Open Credit Enablement Network. And those of us who've been working in financial inclusion and the digital space for a long time, you would know that for small borrowers, getting credit has been a huge challenge. And usually in this country, credit has always been given on basis collateral, whereas most businesses have been doing their work basis cash flow. So Open Credit essentially is able to help that information exchange, help that authentication and identity exchange, and enable small businesses and small borrowers borrow as little as 150 rupees for maybe 3 months, and all the way up to multiple crores of loans in a matter of minutes, right? And that essentially goes on to making that DPI something that's scalable, because once you've really gotten to the actual problem that you've solved, you automatically will generate that access, and you will automatically generate usage. Access and usage. So most DPIs, a lot of DPIs will be generally accessible because you'll have mobile phones, you have that network, you have the technology all over the place. But the challenge is, how do you create usage? Because unless you create that usage, you're not going to bring that impact to the citizen. So when you get into that sweet spot where you're solving for the problem that is really hitting the common man or the common business, that's where you create usage. So I think that's one of the key features, or first key feature that one needs to think about when you're building a DPI. How relevant is it to the market that you're targeting? The other thing, and I think the ambassador also touched base upon it, is openness, right? The more open you're able to make, the more inclusive you're able to make, so that multiple stakeholders can participate on the platform and on the rails that you've created, the more usage again, and the network effects of multiple players participating on the platform comes in. Again, going back to the OKIN or even the UPI platform, you can see that you've got multiple players and multiple use cases, sub-use cases emerging, only because you've enabled private sector innovation, multiple participants being overlapping on each other, and at the same time, the ability for being there in the market without getting excluded by somebody else. This non-exclusivity, which is a core feature of public goods. So when you reinforce that in the digital sense, I think that, adds to the robustness and the scalability of the public good or the DPI. Now, the last thing is obviously, and we were just discussing this before we got into the roundtable, is the issue of trust, right? And if you're not able to build that trust, if you're not able to, if you're not able to ward off incidents, or if you're not able to deal with incidents that happen on a platform, then you've critically affected the usage and the access issue, because people will then start questioning where is their data going and how it is being used, etc. So it's very important to build that institutional framework or the techno-legal context in which the DPI or the DPG must operate in. And it should be clear and enforced by an entity which is looking at operating or is around the DPI, maybe a regulator or some other player like that in the ecosystem. Now, this can differ from country to country or product to product or platform to platform, but it's important to have a mechanism that reinforces and builds that trust continually in the platform. So, again, I'm not going into the details of it, but essentially these are the top level things that one would look at when you want to build a good, robust and secure DPI, as you mentioned it. But going on to financing it, I think that's a very good question. I don't think there is a general solution or general answer for this. Again, as we are building DPIs for different contexts, different solutions, or different countries, different models will emerge. And I think it's important to acknowledge that these different models will work in a particular context and may not work in general use cases. Of course, there are a lot of grants and a lot of funds that are coming up to build DPIs in different developing countries. And I think even developed countries will be asking these questions, whether, how we should be financing it. The India model may not be suitable for everyone, where the government of India is subsidizing a huge part of it. I don't want to, create a controversy, but maybe a tolling model could be something that people could think of, and ultimately your revenue generating model or the funding model will come from the benefit that you derive from operating that platform. So for example, using the digital public infrastructure, we have reduced the cost of access for, let's say, opening a bank account by from $15 to 25 cents, which is 100 times. So who is bearing that savings? Who is getting the benefit of that savings? Is there a revenue model or a funding model there that you can use? So these are the questions that one will have to ask when you're building a financing model, which will vary from use case to use case or country to country. Thank you. Yeah.
Very much, Vivek. I'd like to turn to the first of our sector-specific interventions. I'd like to bring in my colleague, Dr. Tirumala Santramandal here. Question for you, ma'am. I'd like to ask you is, how are digital infrastructures, or more broadly, open digital ecosystems, helping private players build innovative?
Large societal problem, and it is complex and it is dynamic. In order to address the societal problem like healthcare, we need to look into the aspects of openness, into trust building and collaborations. So towards this, in building a DPI, we will give you some classic examples from ICure. As we see that with the COVID, telemedicine has been a viable option. But then ICure aimed to provide telemedicine services with a human touch. At the same time, our frontline health workers were trained digitally, where they were able to provide services within the community and at patients' doorsteps. So we also at the same time were able to make a transition of the public healthcare system, where our Naga Telehealth Services are working with the JICA, that is the Japan International Corporation Agency, or in Jharkhand, one of the tribal, the aspirational districts of Jharkhand, working with the MSD from others. We are providing digitally enabled workforce where the pregnant women are able to demand access to quality care. So we understand that developing a collaborative ecosystem where all the stakeholders need to be a part of the discussion, need to be a part, where learning and exchange of knowledge needs to be there. So as we see that the transition from the public health infrastructure from a dormant state to a dynamic one, we have been able to add value to that. And And at the same time, we also have seen a greater utilization and participation of the beneficiaries, of the last mile beneficiaries, where we are able to make some major impact socially, economically, to a great extent, and right at the grassroots. So I would like to stop there and we'll come back again with further discussions.
Thank you, ma'am. And Dr. Devanjan Chakraborty, we now turn to you. All right. Now, COVID-19 has accelerated digital transformations in education delivery across the world. So, how are international organizations like the British Council, of which you are a director for East India, transitioning to this digital-first approach and drawing on tech-based platforms to promote education, learning, and culture? And culture is a facet which is not often talked about at forums like this. So we'd really like to hear from you about that, education and culture.
Thank you, Anirban, and my apologies for being late. Calcutta's infamous traffic. I think, let me just address the education part of the question first. What had happened prior to the pandemic was the education paradigm globally and in India has been teetering on the edge of a revolution for at least a decade, if not longer. And the only silver lining perhaps of the pandemic was it pushed the education project across the world into that abyss. And we still are awaiting the results of whether the education project being forced to go digital globally, has it crash landed or has it flown? So that, I think, is the key question. And India is a particularly fertile sort of area where we can look at evidence and data on what digital, this kind of forced transition into a digital first or digital only approach during the pandemic did. I think from the British Council's perspective, we did transition all our teaching at the school level for primarily English language, and also all our projects on education and research onto digital platforms, and the whole collaborative model was transitioned into the digital platforms. The thing that's emerging, and I think it's still an emerging picture, we don't have data from across the world or from India that's kind of, we can say with certainty exactly what's happened. So couple of things, I mean, we are using a kind of acronym-based approach, SAMR, SAMR for short. So when it comes to teachers and content within the classroom, I think digital technology has allowed a lot of enhancement in that, on that side. So the S and A stand for substitution and augmentation of teaching, both by teachers as well as in terms of content. But what has been really transformative has been the modification and redefinition of some of the tools of teaching and particularly assessment. I think as we have emerged out of the pandemic, we are letting go of some of the real learnings that we had during the pandemic, using digital first or digital only approach when it comes to assessment. And this more than teaching, I think, is where technology, especially digital technology, can play a huge part in terms of giving very sanitized assessment and feedback loops, and kind of short-circuiting a lot of things that have been kind of typical bottlenecks. I think what we have also realized is, particularly in India, the need for appropriate technology rather than rushing headlong into what is the most expensive and sophisticated technology. There are two examples I can share right here. So in Madhya Pradesh, we have a large teacher education project where we used television and SMS to reach out to the teacher educators. And here in West Bengal, again, we used a private television channel to reach out to the teachers with fairly high quality content for state board students. I think there are certain behavioral changes regarding the stakeholders of education that we need to be aware of. I think there are, 4 primary stakeholders in education. Learners, of course, the students, parents, a stakeholder that is not often talked about in public policy forums, and teachers and school leadership. So I think within that there are varying degrees of changes, kind of behavioral changes that have been triggered by the digital first or digital only approach. I think the whole system is moving towards a more blended kind of approach, and I think it's not very different from what you have mentioned in medicine. And I think there is, again referring to what Your Excellency, the Ambassador was saying, I think there are real urgent need for India to look at democratizing and opening out the hardware and bandwidth side of digital technology in education. I think those are relatively easy to resolve. And I think there are some real benefits we also saw in terms of uptake of a digital library, for instance. Whereas before the pandemic, we had our digital library offer, which has got JSTOR and ProQuest and all of it. That was being accessed primarily from the cities where we were already based, the 4 metros. But during the pandemic, this opened up to 60 other cities from India, and we were witnessing a huge uptake of users from, tier 2 and tier 3 cities of India. And that has really given us some data that the assumption that, tier 2 or tier 3 towns can't access, high bandwidth content. I think that kind of, we were proven wrong on that count. I think I'll come back to the culture pillar a little later. We did put together what is creative economy is a major focus of our work, creative economy and cultural industries. And one of the things that we managed to create during the pandemic was really enhance our research and insights into the impact of the pandemic on the cultural sector in India. So we have published a research called Taking the Temperature Survey in partnership with FICCI, and it's open access, so everyone can access it. And we also have created a platform called Festivals of India. So festivals are a real engine for growth in the cultural and creative economy sector of India. And we have now created this platform where we are inviting festivals from all across India to register. And it's again open access and making it a lot more participative and democratic for people to access festivals from all over the world and from within India, across India.
So much, Dr. Chakraborty. We will back to you. Next, we'd like to hear from Ms. Anisha Singh Motwani. And how, ma'am, do you think large-scale digital infrastructures or platforms are helping boost entrepreneurship and to empower women?
Good afternoon, everyone. Of digital infrastructure has empowered women, not just being in India. Women are the primary caregivers, unfortunately or fortunately, and they always have an added responsibility of work and home. And I think that have just eased out and helped in, effective time management for women and entrepreneurs today. And how can we kind of increase women empowerment, or how can digital infrastructure help in women empowerment? I would like to say that there are 5 key pillars of the digital space today, which if given the correct impetus and growth, would really work in taking women empowerment in every country to another level. So I'll just take you through those 5 pillars. Digital infrastructure obviously is the first and foremost. Access to mobile phones also is something that there is still a huge gap between the male and the female ratio. Just to put it out there, before the pandemic, the gap was about 21%, and after the pandemic, it is still at an 18%. So there is still a huge gap between men and women using the mobile phone, something as basic as the mobile phone. Of course, access to high-speed internet, to also very importantly a safe space to access this internet. There are a lot of places within India where yes, they do have the access, but a lot of women don't feel safe in going to those places alone and accessing. So there are policies and movements to have access in, let's say, national public libraries, for example. So these are things that I think at a very government level we need to make sure, and every country needs to make sure that women are given the same amount of access, and of course affordable access. A lot of times women cannot afford the same things that men can afford. So I think some kind of rebate for women is necessary for them to be able to access the infrastructure that the country has for them. Apart from that, of course, we've grown, like Dr. Ghosh again said, in terms of platforms. We have the digital Aadhaar card, we're all linked. But again, the number of women who have an identity, a digital identity, is far lower than the number of men who have the identity. And for women also, when they have to change that identity, like you get married and you have to change your surname, it's quite a nightmare in terms of the paperwork that you have to go through. So I think again, these obstacles and challenges that women are facing need to kind of be streamlined for them to be able to kind of use the digital power and infrastructure that they have. Coming to the financial services, of course, the UPIs have helped us tremendously. Being able to order groceries for the home in 15 minutes flat, sitting from whether it's a meeting or the office. So that of course has helped, but again, there are a lot of women who do not get payments digitally. The number of women registered with your financial apps again is far lower than the number of men registered in that. So I think, and one important aspect of that is training. They don't know how to use the service. So training and just empowering them with the skill needed to use the app is also something that I think would give women of today a sense of stability and security, which is currently missing. So that was the third pillar. Coming to the fourth and the fifth pillar, which is of business and skill sets. So digital has the power again to. We've seen a lot of women entrepreneurs come up and open up businesses online, but there are a lot of women who have had to shut down businesses because they didn't know how to take it digitally. So the fact that the ability to take your business digitally is something that we need institutes, we need courses, we need trainings for women, and I would suggest that these be free trainings because they would not have the resources to pay for them, to guide them as to how they can continue their business in this new, very robust digital age. So that is another point that I think is very important in today's scenario. Of course, skill sets, of course, training them as to how we could use and how it could benefit them. Like Vivek also said, that it needs to be relevant to them. So, informing them as to how this particular service or this particular digital infrastructure will just enable you to do something faster is something very important. And I just want to give an example, like you said that, you asked me how can it be done. There's this company that was formed in America by a lady called Britt Morin. It's called Self-Made. So the company was formed after the pandemic, and the primary objective of the company is to enable and empower women to become entrepreneurs in this new digital age. So they actually have a 10-week course, a digital entrepreneurship course, where they take you through everything that you need. They also assist you, the organization also assists you with scholarships if you want to do the course but you don't have the resources. And they also assist you with funding for your businesses after you've done the course and opened up your business. So I think we need more of such institutes all over the world, not just in India, of course in India, but we need more of such institutes coming up. And of course being backed by the government and by other associations so that they could continue without having a profitability as a hope on their head. So I think for women, of course, the digital boom has helped a lot. It's helped in creating a lot of women entrepreneurs. But I just think that we are the start of the women revolution, women entrepreneur revolution rather, and I think we have a long way to go before we can actually get somewhere.
Thank you. Thank you for that excellent intervention. These are very hard-hitting points, so thanks for that. And we will now turn to Mr. Varun Kaur from Perth. Now, Varun, conversations about digital health infrastructures are often framed in terms of two key elements: the interoperability of digital platforms and the confidentiality of health data. All right, these are both rather critical aspects. Now, given your experience with digital health initiatives, both in India and across South Asia, how do you think these issues can be best addressed in a way that empowers citizens?
Thank you, Anirban. I think interoperability and data security is quite to cover and quite a lot to cover in 7 minutes. But I think Vivek touched on the security part a bit, so I can maybe focus on interoperability first. I think looking back at the public health system in 2006 to 2013, that era, and I think Dr. Tirumala, you may also resonate with this, India really suffered from what we call pilotitis. At any point, there were about 300 to 350 mHealth, IoT, medtech pilots being run in districts, at state level, in a hospital, with no coherence running along. And all these innovations really focused on and marketed themselves as interoperable, integrated, open source. But the question really was interoperable to what? Integrated into what? Open source for whom, right? And something very interesting that the Indian government did, and a few more LMICs did, is they said, okay, we need to gear down a bit. We need to take this step by step, or we're not going to get anywhere. This is going to continue as it is. And when they looked at a step-by-step approach to digital health and to digital as a whole and DPIs as a whole, they said, first, let's tackle the principles. I think we've spoken a lot about the principles: openness, security, interoperability is one of the core principles of digital public initiatives and infrastructure. And then one point which most countries tend to miss, and India did not, is look at the architecture, look at the language, the techno-legal language behind all of this, look at the frameworks behind our digital health space. We have countless examples of the India 2.0, which focuses on enterprise architecture, the DEPA, which looks at digital security. But the important thing is they put things down on paper that could not only guide the layered approach and the building blocks as it did in Estonia, but also map out the future a little bit. So you aren't just innovating without direction. And this was an important point that I was very glad that India did not miss and continues to build on. And I think the final third step in what I call building this in a step-by-step approach is finally the building blocks. the unique identity, the unique identifiers, the payment layers. And when it comes to health, we have the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, which we've been hearing about for a while, but really it's only in its second year of operation. And in those 2 years, I think they have rolled out the Aadhaar ID, the digital health ID, the hospital facility registries, the doctor registries, that becomes your single source of truth when we're talking about any digital initiative layered on. But what I'm really excited about, and what Path, is very excited about when we look at our implementation, are two more aspects. One is the unified health interface, and the second is the health claims exchange, which is yet to come up. Now, the UHI is the language that the tech will speak. It's open source, open protocol rather language. I don't need to understand that language. The esteemed panel does not need to understand that language, but our technology will speak that same language. That is where interoperability comes into play, and that is where true integration will really thrive in a scale of 1.3 billion. The HCX, I think Vivek had mentioned about the private sector. Indian public health is not really Indian public health. Indian health is 70% private, 30% public. So you cannot have a public health digital ecosystem without the private sector. And the health claims exchange really looks at the financial aspect of things. It looks at how the National Health Authority will look and integrate the multiple insurance schemes that we have, look and streamline this, because when you're a patient and when you're going through your patient journey, you will go through the public sector, you will go through the private sector, you will go through your own pocket, you will go through an insurance scheme. And how do you get all of this to work? I think that health claims exchange really will hopefully tie it together when it comes about. And how to make interoperability empowering for citizens, I think, Anirban, interoperability is the most empowering for citizens when it's completely invisible. When was the only time I really, took a step back with UPI and payments is when I realized that I hadn't been carrying my wallet around for 2 months. I had just, been using my phone. That's what interoperability means, when you just take a step back and say, this has made my life tremendously easier. And thank you for the bell. I think I'm going to jump over to data security now. We do have a data empowerment and protection architecture, which was used in the India stack for our payments interface. A lot of that got transposed to health. But when you're talking about health, when you're talking about personal data, it becomes a lot more personal. When you go to a doctor, when you're taking your child or your mother or yourself, data there takes on a whole new meaning. So I think comfort and creating empowerment within citizens, I think really needs to look at the legal language. India had tabled data protection policy for 4 years. They discussed it, debated it, eventually pulled it back and started to work on something new. Now, you may say pulling it back is, it sucks because you've been working on it for 4 years, but I think it's quite impressive that after 4 years of deliberation, the judiciary and the Indian government said, no, we're getting ahead of ourselves. This is too complicated. We need to simplify it for the citizens. We pull it back. We need to take a look at it again and put it forward in a simpler fashion. So I think until that legality and the protection aspects come about, I think that is when the true comfort comes in and the true empowerment comes in. Of course, all the agencies are working on their own to empower and secure citizens' data. The National Health Authority in the ABDM only allows the patient to share their information with their doctor. The doctor cannot claim any information. If I switch doctors, another doctor will have to request that I share all my records with him. Thank you so much, and down to kind of.
Thanks. Thank you. First round of interventions from our speakers. Round 2 is really going to be about the G20, how some of the lessons and approaches talked about can be institutionalized and be shared across G20 nations. One of the best things about the G20 as a group is that it consists of both developed and developing nations. And India in some ways is already being seen as the voice of the global south. So many of the lessons, the things being done here, solutions being provided, are relevant and are applicable in other countries as well. And that is what we'd like to focus on now. So, going backwards, going in reverse, let me come straight back to you, Varun. So certain best practices, so to speak, solutions like the UHI or the Health Claims Exchange, how can these be made applicable outside India? How can some of these lessons be shared with other G20 countries? What sorts of mechanisms are possible?
I think
Take this knowledge elsewhere, outside India.
I think this is where the DPI and the digital public goods aspects come into place. We know CoWIN was one of the most successful digital public goods to emerge out of India as something that was readily shareable. I think it went across, it was multiple countries picked it up, looked at its code and tried to understand what they could take of it, which was relevant to them. I think the DPG route is very good. In terms of frameworks, I think particularly building out of South Asia, India at a scale, if it implements DPIs and it continues to show that it can implement DPIs at a huge scale, I think the learnings first immediately to spread into a South Asian context and then further global would be a very interesting trajectory in my opinion. First looking at how our immediate neighbors, PIN can maybe first learn more directly from our experiences, our wins, our failures, as we did from multiple, health systems abroad, and then almost take South Asian or regional learnings and then take them forward. I think those are two potential routes that we could explore.
What you're suggesting is we start regionally as a kind of pilot, a test bed for some of these solutions, and then broad base it and take it to the G20, a more sort of international grouping like that.
Definitely, and I think the G20 has proven that they're not completely afraid of failures. You have to learn from your failures, and if you don't, you're shooting yourself in the foot. So I think a lot of best practices is where did I go wrong, and what have I learned from there. I think that's something that definitely should not be ignored. But yeah, thank you for.
Okay, thank you so much. That's well taken. And now, Anisha, back to you. So, some of the core points you raised about how were made more inclusive, made more women-friendly. And this is not about the tech itself, but also about ancillary services such as the training and sensitization of women, right, in order to facilitate their inclusion at scale. How do you think this can be done? And, what are the kind of partnerships and the stakeholders who should be involved in a process like this? Government, of course, being one of them. How can skilling programs like this be designed better, more consultatively, and these lessons applied not just in India but outside as well?
Come from the topmost levels in their decisions on their policies, on their plans, for the future. And I think right now I don't really see a lot of women entrepreneurs being included in conversations or in policy making decisions. So I think that would be a start for at least our country. Make sure that a lot of these things are implemented. In fact, I've been reading articles of even things which I implemented in places like Uganda, where they are looking at spending, I think one article I read was $200 million being spent on just providing free access to women across. So I think that a lot of the budgets and a lot of the resources that we have just need to be allocated correctly. And like we have funding for startups, we need to have a specific segment or a specific policy or specific help for women-led startups or women. I think there are various ways in which they can be done, but I think that the conversation has to start somewhere. And honestly, I don't feel that the conversation is really started at a national level or at a larger level. They're more at the grassroots level at the moment. I feel that the moment this conversation kind of starts, things and policies and everything else will kind of streamroll into the whole process and into every government's plan for that particular state or for that particular country. So I think for me, I think it would be the conversation needs to begin somewhere.
Chakravarti, the summer model you talked about was really very interesting. So how, as an organization like the British Council, both bilaterally in the countries that you work with, and also through a grouping like the G20, actually sort of spread and disseminate some of these lessons and learnings that you've acquired since the COVID period?
I think in terms of institutionalizing some of these learnings through G20, you are right that we are working both bilaterally with the Government of India at one level and also multilaterally through G20 to provide collaborative solutions. I don't think they are just one-way traffic. I mean, UK learns a huge deal from India and its practices, and we've learned during COVID as well. We have looked very closely at the two, the two domains that British Council is looking at quite closely to support on G20. And on the education pillar, we are looking to support the EdTech and digital technology side of things, and the conversations have started that are bilateral at the moment, and we hope that it will sort of open out. One of the real wins in recent times in the leading up to G20 has been the signing of the mutual recognition of qualifications between long pending, and we hope that this will lead towards, and G20 will play its part in smoothing the free trade agreement between India and UK, which has been in the pipeline. On the culture pillar, I think there are 4 priority areas. We're responding to all 4, but there's 2 pillars which I think we have particular things to share and help and support, and again learn bilaterally, is on creative economy and cultural industries. That's the most important one. And research and insights, I mentioned in my initial comments that is something that is a real strength of the British Council and the UK. And we are working with the Indian government, but also multilaterally with the Indian government, both at the center and at the state level, to help create an internationally validated creative economy and cultural industries policy. And you mentioned the impact of COVID on women from various perspectives. We also know from our research and insights that within the cultural industries in India employs the largest number of people after agriculture. And nearly 60% of the people employed in the creative industries in India are women. And COVID has shown us that the impact on loss of income on women through a disruption like that is humongous. It affects not just livelihood, but lives. So I think there are conversations that we are trying to warm and brew that we hope will lead to adoption of inclusive and supportive creative economy and cultural industries. Also looking at technology, leveraging technology for arts and culture. And of course, the pillar that's very relevant for India is heritage arts and crafts for sustainable livelihoods. And again, there's a lot of bilateral work, especially with the non-government sector, the civil society sector, working with, for example, here we work very closely with banglanatok.com, which is a social enterprise working in arts and culture, and we do it across India. Hope that we will be able to bring this together.
My next question, well, and this is a slightly tricky question, and I did this very well myself either. G20 is a large macro-level government process. share, work at a somewhat micro level with communities on the ground, but of course, district level authorities with state governments, etc. How do you think some of the best practices that you are applying or seeing on the ground can sort of percolate upwards, so to speak, and be shared through a much larger, more macro grouping like? How do you think this process of sharing best practices or case studies?
Thank you, Anirban, for the question. So, as you rightly mentioned, we are, closely working with the last mile communities. So, a few of the lessons learned, which I can share it with you. One is there's an importance on data privacy. But at the same time, we should also be liberal with sharing of data across borders. So while we talk on this, we have been working with ODI and Microsoft in bringing up a collaborative ecosystem where the learning and the knowledge could be shared across the borders in a seamless manner. So at the same time, we also see that we also need to see how the DPI will be relevant for a last mile community, where Ms. Anisha mentioned that there's a huge gap in the gender we can see of mobile phones. So in this aspects, we have been working in this Jharkhand as well as in different, we are present now in 10 states. Yeah. And we see that we need to enable technology so that it empowers the last mile community, and we need to the resource management, that is bringing the women community at the forefront, where they are we are taking care of the livelihood, we are taking they are coming at the forefront, so that they become more confident, they become the voice of the community, so that the transparency, the exchange of trust and ownership takes place across different levels. And the third, of course, is that while we are working with the data, that is, we are owning this data. We have this huge data source across, the customer base. So while we are collecting this data, it is important for us in looking at the source of the data, how the data has been collected and for what purpose it has been used. So we feel that a need of taking into consideration the demographics together with the lifestyle changes, with the livelihood patterns, goes a long way in bringing meaningful insights into research, so that it gives us a proper idea about a disease management, about a disease progression, how the knowledge can be shared to the clinicians, to the patients, for frontline health workers. And this is how this lesson needs to be taken across to the G20, that we are enabling all the actors in the healthcare ecosystem at different levels, with trust, with ownership, and with collaborations.
Is already doing things of this kind. Can anyone share its knowledge and practices about the creation of DPIs across borders, and platforms like MOSIP, how are they helpful? How are they facilitating this cross-border collaboration?
Yeah.
And so
No, I think first of all, the question is quite pertinent. One of the things, when I was listening to one of the speakers, I could hear a pertinent bird chirp, and I was just reminded how COVID was positive in some ways, where it sort of helped nature come back, and the other positive thing was everybody realized that they really need digital systems in place, right? And like literally the proverbial tide which had gone out, and everybody saw who's swimming with or without shorts, and so we have been seeing that there's been a huge scramble to build digital systems or to empower citizens digitally. And if you look at the basic three foundational elements of DPIs, which is your identity, payments, and data, I think India is probably one of the only countries that has solved reliably, scalably for all three. And I think in that sense, the countries that have not yet solved, they are actively looking at the various models that are out there. So you've got the Web3 model, which I think a couple of countries are looking at. You've got the big tech-led model, which a lot of countries will lean towards, and then you've got the DPI model. So it becomes really critical for us to jump into the discussion, those of us who have solved using DPIs, to jump into the discussion and sort of talk about why DPIs is the way to go and what we should be doing to build to build DPIs for their context. And I think there are three specific things that we can do. One is obviously start publicizing and talking about the successful use cases and stories that we've been identifying within the country. Success stories like Aadhaar or OCAN or ONDC as they're being developed. I think these are very interesting use cases and success stories that people must be made aware of, because these are the complex DPIs that you can build over the foundational elements, and it's important for countries to understand how certain problems which are universal can be solved. The other thing which I think is even more critical is to start anchoring and building standards in institutions, like you mentioned, MOSIP, right? One of the things that, in the initial parts of building a DPI is we sort of saw it, the India context and we built for India, and we never really thought about building the standards globally and, building how would it operate in a global context. And I think now that realization is setting in, and I think we're sort of building those institutions and safeguards and thinking about what should be the general use case, the general framework of certain things, certain DPIs that we are building. The last thing that I think India is also uniquely positioned for is the ability to convene all the players required for implementation. I think as a digital superpower, we have some of the biggest companies and players in the world. I think not only in, sort of taking the success stories globally, but we can also talk about how to operationalize at the granular level and sort of bring those players to the table and say, okay, here's the model that you've agreed on. Okay, we can help you build it. Right from the conceptual to the physical and the actuals. So I think, top level, these are the 2-3 things that we can be actively doing, and we are doing it. So if you look at, you mentioned MOSIP, we are already getting MOSIP in about 9 countries, potentially about 500 million citizens, 500 million citizens globally. So I don't think that's it's a very small number in the larger scheme of things. I think it's going to grow. We are looking at UPI linkages with various countries. So there are different ways that we are sort of taking it abroad and building that global network of DPIs. And this has just started.
Best of yours, back to you and back to where we began. Spoke about cross-border collaborations and the pooling with other clusters of countries, the Nordic countries, other countries within the EU. How can some of these practices and methodologies be sort of institutionalized and presented to the G20 as a way of sharing knowledge across countries and pooling resources?
Thank you. I'm not entirely sure all these examples are applicable to G20, as G20 is still a network of countries that can showcase certain things, but it's not the standardization body or some other institution. But definitely there are some takeaways that I believe will also be useful for G20, and one of them is actually related to sustainability, which was mentioned in our first round, and that is actually quite a big issue around digital public goods. If we talk about open source, reusable solutions such as MOSIP, there are so many others that come from India. There are several that come from Estonia, like our X-Road. We have a lot of AI solutions and so forth, because often these solutions come from foundations, some private funders, and so forth. And when you put yourself in the role of a government and you have to find a solution that will become a critical part of your infrastructure, then you cannot rely on some private funders or foundations that may come and go. then one solution, of course, is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel still. You can take the solution that is there and you find an implementer. And it may not remain a digital public good. It may become a closed code system. And many countries go that way. We see that from our experience with the public goods, because X-Road has been available for the others since 2006, and around 40 countries implement it, and some use that way. The other way, and I think this comes to your question, what we have done in Estonia, we have created really state-supported foundation. We call it Nordic Institute of Interoperability Solutions, where we, states that we are friends, come together and let's say X-Road as one digital public good is maintained and developed by these states that own the foundation. So each year we come together, we see what are the amendments needed, there are new security requirements and so forth. Approximately this one solution costs around 3 million euros a year, and then we share this between the founders. So maybe an idea for G20 could actually be also to look at these sustainability or management models that could be there around the public goods or the public infrastructure that could be maybe then used in one or the other circumstances. But it could be also an interesting, of course India is a big country, yeah, so you will not have these issues, but many countries have the lack of skills issue. So there could be these regional approaches, maybe, let's say, Western Africa or some other regions where countries in the region come together and they make a foundation for digital public goods. But I wanted to address two other things where I believe that we should also, I guess, shouldn't forget that digitalization is actually not about technology. So from that perspective, whether we are talking now, let's say, a commercial software or an open source, there is actually not so much difference. I probably don't know a country that has not attempted to introduce identity, because we all need to authenticate ourselves. And sometimes these technologies are proprietary, sometimes they're open source. There are not so many success cases either or. So ultimately, it will not be about open or not. Of course, as we discussed here, we have all agreed that the way to go is why we are here. But we have to understand that it's really about how you implement these technologies. So it's about change. And I think maybe the second idea that could be maybe to explore by G20 is actually related, that was also referred to by our co-panelists in different occasions, that there is an experience by now, let's say 30 years of public sector digitalization. And we could come up with some commonalities across these very different countries that are needed to, let's say, put EID in place, whether open source or not. But what are the organizational changes and processes that need to be taken into account? What are the policy framework, the legal framework, and so many other aspects apart from technological specifications? And we have started this work a little bit in Estonia. I mentioned before a GovStack initiative that we started 2 years ago with Germany and the National Telecommunication Union and Dial, that I know is also where we are really trying to bring together this experience across private and public sector and trying to guarantee the neutrality between big and small players, which may be a challenge sometimes, but really to look at the experience. Yeah, Estonia, Singapore, Austria, Chile, Peru, Uganda, and really see what are the commonalities and come up with certain sort of specifications, as we call them, both technological, but also what is around it. And some of this could also extend on the work of also what. But that's all from my side, so discussion also, and I say.
That wraps up the spirit of our discussion very well, and that brings us to the end of the panel discussion proper.
Okay, so I need not take the lectern, I presume. Let me thank yet again the speakers. I think this was an exhilarating discussion. And I'm sure that Anirban will be creating an event report out of this. And eventually, just a small announcement in here that just once you visit the T20 India website, you will find that there is a call for abstracts. And there are 7 task forces. One of the task forces, of course, happens to be this one, the one under which the first T20 side event took place. So you are requested to go through them. You're requested to actually submit an abstract. You might find today, if you visit it, that the last date of submission of abstract for the policy briefs is 10th of Jan. But for your confidential information, it's going to be up by tomorrow. The last date has been extended to 17th of Jan. So please feel free to submit abstracts, because all these policy briefs are going to go up to the convenings, and they are going to be formed into a compendium and finally a communique. So this is definitely an opportunity to actually inform the real policymakers in the G20. So thank you all, thanks to all the speakers, and thanks in fact to the audience who played a major role in making this particular event a major success, and of course the entire faculty members and staff members of Observer Research Foundation, Kolkata, as also the T20 Secretariat, who worked incessantly to bring this particular thing together. Thanks a lot yet again.